reading it. But it seems to me, Peter, and I'll just say a few words and then it's over to you, is that like many of us, I'm increasingly worried at the rightward shift in our politics across the world. You know, whether it's Bolsonaro, India, Turkey, Hungary, not to mention the whole Brexit phenomenon that we've experienced in the UK, and of course Trump. But even more worryingly and more particular to the island of Ireland, and Rob might have thoughts on this and we can maybe have a discussion, I am getting increasingly worried about the rise of a kind of radical right wing in Ireland, which we haven't really seen since the blue shirts in the 1930s. And that's why I think, Peter, the topic of your book in terms of binary, divisive, majoritarian types of decision making can actually be, you know, a prelude to populism, and usually of a right wing sort. I'll just throw out there that you can have left wing populism. That populism itself isn't necessarily, in my view, bad. You can have more progressive forms of it, but certainly the way in which we see the world going is in this much more 1930s style populist direction. And so therefore, Peter, I think your book is not just of academic interest, but it's, you know, almost a cautionary tale and of practical interest in terms of an intervention, in terms of tracing the connections, which I'm no doubt your presentation will do, between the rise of particularly right-wing populism, xenophobia, the othering of particularly marginalized communities that we now see, you know, across the world, and how and what ways can we trace that to political decision-making processes. I think also we need to understand the way the political economy of the world is changing, and that many people do feel left behind. So there are issues that can't be fully explained only by decision-making processes, although they're important. So for me, Peter, I do wish you all the best with this, this book. I would encourage you, as you always do, to be prolific in, you know, getting this out into the public discussion. But I think even more so now, it's the challenge of that populism. Because I'll just end on this, as many of you know, and some of you, like Peter and Eileen and Tony, you know, been associated with the Green Party, I do fear that some of the climate policies coming down the pipeline will lead to a gilets jaunes type reaction that we've seen in France. Now, whether or not that can be solved by more inclusive democratic decision-making processes, I don't know, but I can only tend to think that they possibly would. Wouldn't it be great to include the people who are going to be affected by a tax or a change in a decision-making process? So actually, Peter, you've answered a question that I'm going to ask you to come on and speak to my students about, which I was discussing earlier on today. And the question I set them was this: does this solution to the planetary emergency require more or less democracy? And it seems to me you'd be gratified to know that they all came down on the side of more democracy, but I'm afraid it's not liberal democracy. It's much more participatory, deliberative forms of democracy of the type that you've been championing now for many decades. So at least with my students, Peter, you're an overnight success after 50 years. So I'll hand it over to you and look forward to your presentation. So if everybody else could put their mics on mute, that'll stop the feedback mechanism.
Okay, John, thank you very much. As we all know, North Korea calls its country the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Well, these four folks aren't being terribly democratic at the moment, but never mind. That's Granddad on the left and Daddy on the right, and no doubt Kim Jong-un will join them shortly, perhaps. But it is a democracy, or at least that's what they say it is, and they have elections, and they have a parliament, and it's twice as big as the parliament in Seoul. It only meets once a year, but well, no, it can't be perfect. And it's very simple. The party, the only party, chooses the candidate, Mr. X, it's usually a he, and then the people vote. And the question on the ballot paper is candidate X, yes or no. And that's it. And, well, in fact, of course, it's more like candidate X, yes or yes. But what a crazy system. That's what we in the West argue. And elections should offer a choice, for heaven's sake. And we in the West, well, we have referendums and votes in Parliament and so on. And the party in power chooses the option X. It's normally a singleton. And the ballot reads option X, yes or no. And in fact, of course, in parliamentary votes, where the subject is subject to the party whip, then it's more like option X, yes or yes. What a crazy system, I argue. And not just elections, but decision-making should also offer a choice. Democracy, they say, is for the common good. Well, you can't best identify any commonality with a binary vote, which often falls to one side or the other. Democracy, the greatest good for the greatest number, seeks the superlative, and you cannot best identify the superlative in a voting procedure which is only comparative. Alas, the world thinks that democracy is based on decisions taken by majority vote. Minority rule is wrong, ergo majority rule, it is thought, must be okay. But there are lots of ways of identifying a majority opinion. Apart from binary voting, you can have multi-option voting. And with multi-option voting, there are actually quite a few ways of counting. You can have the option with the most top preferences, or the one with the least bottom preferences, or the one with the highest average, and you have a knockout system. You can do whatever you like. Unfortunately, the world has adopted the simplest, just binary voting, and based a form of rule upon that binary voting called binary majority rule, in a word, majoritarianism, which has caused countless conflicts. It's been a cause. Northern Ireland, we had the Troubles, and majority rule was part of the problem there. In the Balkans, well, all the wars in the former Yugoslavia started with a referendum, and that's a quote from Oslobodjenie, which is Sarajevo's famous newspaper. And in Rwanda, the slogan, Rubanda Nyamwinshi, was how the Interahamwe started the genocide in 1994. It means we are the majority. In the Soviet Union, well, the Russian word for majoritarianism is Bolshevism. And a Bolshevik is a member of the majority. And China is probably the world's worst example of binary politics, was in Mao Zedong's anti-rightist campaign of 1960, part of the Great Leap Forward. It led to the famine and the deaths of up to 40 million people. Indeed, every country seems to have suffered from majoritarianism in one way or another. So I went on a journey. And I started here in Belfast, of course. I went across. I invited myself to be invited by TEDx in Vienna, which is down here somewhere. And I gave the TEDx talk, and then I just kept going. I went down through the Balkans, which I know quite well, and then into the Caucasus, which I know quite well as well, and then down to Iran, which I don't know very well. And in Iran, I had visa problems. Partly, my Visa credit card was running out because of the sanctions, and it just didn't work. And secondly, Turkmenistan, which is here, doesn't like foreigners very much, and they don't give visas very easily. So I had to fly to Urumqi, which is in Xinjiang, in Western China. And then I went down to KASHGAR, and then across China and all over Eastern China, spent a few days in North Korea, and then came back on the Trans-Siberian Railway to Moscow and then home. And yes, nearly every country has suffered from majoritarianism in one way or another. So I wrote a book. And then I went on another journey, almost the same, this time entirely overland. So having gone down to the Balkans, and I then went to the Caucasus again, but then I got the train up to Moscow and then did back on the Trans-Siberian, this time into Siberia and Manchuria and down to Beijing that way. And I managed to do 11 book launches in 11 different jurisdictions and spread the word that way. I had a few problems, like when I was in a minibus trying to get across the border from Georgia into Russia, from Tbilisi to Vladikavkaz. I was stopped and detained and interrogated by the Russians because they don't like NGOs very much. And then when I was in China, in Gansu, which is just about here, and this was in January of this year, and I got caught by the virus, not by the disease itself, but by the lockdown that was part of it. So let me start in China. It's an amazing geography, actually. You've got the TAKLAMAKAN desert here, and there's the Gobi desert here, and you go from desert to TIANJIN mountains on the top, and the Himalayan mountains down below, and the Pamirs to the west. It is absolutely amazing. This is the TAKLAMAKAN. The word is an old Uyghur word, and it means those who go in do not come out. So I went round. But this mountain that you're looking at is made of sand. It's almost impossible to climb because it's so soft, and your foot, every time you step forward, your foot sinks into this terribly soft sand. The Chinese were here over 2,000 years ago, before the Uyghurs arrived. And my next port of call was KASHGAR, which we hear a lot about in the news these days. This is the old part of town which has been redone by the Chinese in the Uyghur style. I think it's quite nice, actually. We don't hear much about this on the news. We just hear the other stories. But KASHGAR was just, this photograph, by the way, was taken in 2018. But it reminded me of Belfast in the 1970s. Wow, 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 wow. Police patrols all over the place, constantly up and down. Every time you go into a shop or a restaurant, you get the body search, just as we had here. And there are stop and search going on the streets all the time, mainly against the Uyghurs. The Chinese security policy is pretty blunt, but as I say, it's very similar to what we had in Belfast. This was in Turapan, Tulufan. And this woman, she's a Uyghur, and there she is selling her shashlik. And I don't think there were many Catholics selling shashlik on the Falls Road during the Troubles, dressed up as IUC officers. And she was just having fun. And I saw this in KASHGAR as well. And sure enough, I was arrested. And it was a high security problem. And these two guys, again Uyghurs, this was again in Tulufan, and they decided that I was far too old to cycle all the way to the railway station. So they folded up my bike and put it in the back of the car and gave me a lift, which was very nice. But yes, the Chinese security apparatus is heavy-handed. And they do have internment, but there again, we had internment. And they do have horrible, the stories are horrible about the concentration camps and so on. But we had H blocks. And okay, the scale in China is much more serious, much larger, but it's very similar. And I don't think we have got quite the high moral grounds that we sometimes pretend that we do have. So my next port of call was in Gansu, which is the province to the east of Xinjiang. And these mountains in the background, the TIANJIN, they're fairly small fry really compared to the other mountains we've just been talking about. And the agriculture is fairly simple. This was in February 2018. And this guy is just getting ready to play his part in feeding a population of over 1 billion. And as you can see, the technology is pretty primitive, and he's adding to soil erosion by turning it all over in the way he's doing. But there we are. They have elections in China, in the villages. If you live in the towns or cities, then your children get medical health care and so on, but you don't have elections. But in the villages, you do have elections. And they have a village hall, and in this particular village, population about 500, they elect 3 people, and they look after everything, which is not very much. So I went down to the village hall to see what the crack was, and there was nobody there. So I asked a local passerby, I said, where are they? Oh, they've gone home. Oh, okay. So I get on my little bike and I go to the local town, and I find the town hall, and I asked to meet a few officials to talk about things and things. And I start off by talking about the water table. And sure enough, they get the snow on the mountains, and that provides the water. But of course, the water table, like everywhere else on the planet, is going down. And then we started talking about, well, democracy and things like that. And one by one, these officials made their excuses. And then I was left all by myself. So I asked the girl behind the counter, I said, where are they? Oh, they're busy. So, well, I thought, well, that's all I can do here. So I went back to my little village, and that was that. And the next day, a car arrives full of officials, and they have photographs of ballot boxes, and they tell me exactly what happens, and sure enough, it does. Yes, as I say, they elect 3 people, they have the right of recall, and those 3 people then do what they have to do, which, as I say, was not very much. It's all under the one-party system, but at a village level, it doesn't matter very much. On previous visits to China, I have given lectures, like this one in LANZHOU University, about 200 students. I gave lectures all across Europe and even in Iran, but in China, I was quite surprised that this was possible. And there are sort of limitations on what you can do, and I started by talking very gently about decision-making in workers' collectives and that sort of thing, and not using the word democracy very often. But even so, I was able to talk about what I always talk about, which is decision-making, and showing how majority voting is, well, pretty useless, really. Let me go back to there, because my first appointment on this occasion in 2018 was a university lecture in Anyang University, which is getting closer to Beijing. And I got to Anyang at the invitation of one of the members of staff there. She had been in the Confucius Institute here in Belfast, and she invited me to come along, and so everything was official and blah, blah, blah. And on the Monday, we met the dean and had a cup of tea, and yes, everything was fixed for the Friday, no problem. And on the Wednesday, everything was cancelled. So, needless to say, I say, why? No reply. But the answer was perfectly clear. Xi Jinping in Beijing was turning himself into the emperor, sort of, and the atmosphere was palpable. People did not want to lose their jobs. But later on, this is in NANKAI University, which in Tianjin, and I also gave a lecture in Beijing University, in one of them. They have quite a few. And here well, maybe it's because the professor is Yang Long, there he is getting old. He's now retired, so he didn't have to worry about his job very much. And what surprises me is that in this lecture hall, and I was invited in, and then they said, well, can you sit down for a moment? And they showed my YouTube. There it is on the screen on the right-hand side. And in theory, as we all know, China has the firewall, and YouTube and Facebook and all that sort of stuff are banned. But there again, if you get VPN, you can get around it. And this university got around it, and there's no problem. May Wenti, as they say. And then I went to XUZHOU University, And this is for the China book launch. XUZHOU University was where I first gave my first lecture in China, which was in 2013. And everything has flowed since then, partly from the people I met, and this is Professor Xiong Pa. And this was out in the foyer, and when they Chinese decide to look after you, they do it in style. It was brilliant. And so the lecture that I then gave as part of the book launch, and it involved electronic voting, and the students had their mobiles. Everybody's got a mobile these days. And with a bit of deborder software, we used electronic preference voting. We did the same in Beijing, and it was no problem. So my message, basically what I was talking about, was the fact that if you are going to take a decision, then majority voting is not the best way of doing it. It's okay if the problem is totally non-controversial. Should we now break for coffee? Yeah, you can do that by majority vote by all means. But if the subject is controversial, then I argue that we should never, ever be taking a binary vote. So if you have the situation where there is a problem, then doubtless somebody will want to do something about it. And if we have a democracy, you'll have to discuss it first. So somebody moves a problem, moves a motion, and let's call that option A. Jolly good. And if it's a contentious problem, then in a plural democracy, we're out of China now, we're talking about voting theory. In a plural democracy, someone's else are bound to have a different idea. So let's say they propose an amendment, and if the motion is amended, well, we'll call that option B. And then, of course, there's always the status quo ante, which is option C. So in every debate on every contentious problem, complex, controversial, call it what you like, there is bound to be at least 3 options on the table. And I would argue there should be at least 3. There's a similar number of options, or at least a short list of options on the ballot paper. Brexit was a classic example of a multi-option problem where we only had a binary vote, and what a nonsense it was. So let us have a look at a theoretical situation of 4 options, A, B, C, and D. And we've got 15 voters, which is the same number that they have in the United Nations Security Council. And let us, assume that they have preferences as follows. And this is obviously a very contentious situation because the 6 voters and their set of preferences is A, D, C, B, is exactly the opposite of the 4 voters, which is B, C, D, A. And then you have a few other voters, and neither of them think B or A is very good. And A is obviously very divisive, and B is not much better. And maybe the consensus, if there is one, is going to be C and D, C or D. So let's have a look and see what happens in practice. And if we have a plurality vote, and we're going back now to that theory that there are lots of ways of counting a multi-option vote, then with a plurality vote, you just count the first preferences, and so the social choice, the winner, is A, because A gets a score of 6, and B has 4, and C 3, D 2. In the 2-round vote, you take, if nothing has got a majority in the first round, you take the 2 leading options, which is A and B, and then you have a majority vote between those 2, and if everybody's preferences stay the same, then these 9 guys all prefer B to A, so the winner is now B with a score of 9. And if we have the alternative vote, which is a bit like STV, without the PR, of course, you're making a decision, so you can only make one decision. And with the alternative vote, well, D is eliminated in the first round because it got such a miserable score of only 2, and its 2 votes go to C. So the second stage score is A6, B4, and C now 5. So that's the end of B, and its 4 votes go to Oh, they go to C as well. So C now wins with a score of 9 to A6. And if we take a points system, the modified border count as it's called, then we have 4 points for first preference, 3 for a second, 2 for a third, and so on. And we just add up all the points, and well, guess what? D comes out on top with 43 and C 42 and so on. So if we have the question, do you want A or B or C or D? Then the answer is we want A or B or C or D. And it depends upon which voting procedure is used. It doesn't depend upon the preferences of the voters at all in this particular scenario. But to devise these theoretical, hypothetical scenarios is so easy. I've done it so often. There are many, many instances where you can show that plurality voting and two-round voting and the alternative vote are just inaccurate. So if the status, so the conclusion is that the majority voting is just no good because that gives far too much power to the people who set the question. And if the subject matter is controversial, then it should be put to a multi-option vote, a bit of pluralism, and whether it's the UN Security Council or the US Congress or parliaments in Berlin or Beijing or whatever, then we should have lots of options on the table and on the ballot paper, and then let all concerned cast their preferences. So you have just one vote. You don't take amendments to one in a binary process, amendment A, yes or no, and then amendment B, yes or no, and blah, 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 because that might give you the wrong answer as well. The modified border count, as it is called, is far more accurate. It's over 200 years old. It's far more accurate than any majority vote and whatever. And it's also non-majoritarian. It identifies the option with the highest average preference. And an average involves every voter, not just a majority of them. So if this system was adopted, there would be no further justification for binary majority rule. So every country could have all-party power sharing, and we would no longer have the crazy situation which we have under binary majority rule, where the world is run by minorities of one: Bolsonaro, Trump, Modi, Netanyahu, all these usually men, and quite often climate deniers, and they are operating policies for which there is no consensus. And it's dangerous. And if we redefine democracy, and to answer your question at the beginning, John, yeah, if we have more democracy, then I think we can move beyond this simple majority rule, this elected dictator stuff, which is so harmful and sometimes so violent in its consequences. And we move to a more inclusive, a more rational, a more nuanced way of doing things. And maybe then we might be able to solve the problems of survival. I mean, COVID is telling us that we have to cooperate, but climate change is telling us we have to cooperate. And with majority voting, we're not cooperating. We're voting for or against each other. And with preference voting, we can talk with each other and then vote with each other. And have a, yes, as I say, a more rational debate. I did my 9th book launch in Taiwan, at the Taiwan National University in Taipei. And then it was time for a bit of a break because it was the Chinese New Year, which was 25th of January, you remember? The year of the rat. But the rat in China is regarded as not in the same way as we regard it here. I went back to Gansu, where I've been, as I was saying earlier, 2 years earlier. And for the New Year, yes, they drink baijiu. It's called baijiu. It means literally white spirit, but it's their sort of the Chinese equivalent of vodka, I suppose. It's pretty strong stuff, about 50%. And of course, for the New Year, everybody's visiting everybody, and you're having yet more baijiu, and it's very nice. But it is quite strong. And on the next day, the first day of the New Year, they go to their ancestors' graves. And they light little fires like this one here, and they use paper money. They make these artificial sort of bits of paper to make them look like 50 yuan notes and 100 yuan notes, and then they burn them. And then they pour baijiu, not just water, not just fake stuff. They pour the real thing over the grave. I was quite surprised at that. And then the next day, bingo, or should I say bingdu, which is the Chinese word for the coronavirus. The news was declared, China was in lockdown. The village was closed. There were only two roads, one in, one out, and they were both barricaded. And I was stuck. There again, as the old saying goes, you only ever hear successful stories. Thank you very much.